So welcome all of you to the May edition of these monthly meetings. Again, I want to remind you we're going to have a special session of these monthly meetings 1 month from today, the second Wednesday of June, here, same time, same place, be devoted to a discussion of Marxism based on that book, Understanding Marxism, that we produced recently, whose purpose is to stimulate and inform discussion of this very, very important part of the socialist tradition. I want to remind you also, both those of you here this evening and those of you who watch this on YouTube and other formula, I might mention, some of you I know were here 2 months ago, the March session, which was devoted to China. We recently crossed the 200,000 mark of the number of people that watched that evening's discussion here through YouTube. It's absolutely extraordinary what kind of exposure these things get. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And one way you can support this, those of you watching and those of you here, is to go to a page on the web called Patreon, Patreon. If you're not familiar with it, it's a simple way. You go to Patreon, and then you use our initials, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update, GCLEU. And if you support us with as little as, I think, $2 or $3 a month, or more, of course, if you'd like, you get to see all these videos, you get to see the past video, the whole archive is available to you, and I think you might find that useful, and it's a way of supporting us. For no money at all, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. That is extremely helpful to us. It doesn't cost you anything except to click the button and subscribe on the YouTube channel. We produce a good bit of our material at the YouTube studios, and our ability to do that is funded, in effect, by how many subscribers we have on YouTube. Okay. Finally, we also offer on our Patreon page and as part of our program a number of podcasts. If you haven't been to our YouTube channel and our websites, you may not know this, but we now have the following. David Harvey produces a regular podcast called Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. Regularly, every couple of weeks, he produces a whole analysis of things which we then put up on this platform, and it gets out, tens of thousands of people. We have one on Puerto Rico. It's called Puerto Rico Forward, produced by a lawyer in Puerto Rico who works with us about all the things that are going on in that part of the world. Dr. Harriet Fraud, that some of you may know, does something called Capitalism Hits Home, how the capitalist problems shape your personal life, your intimate life, your home life, your relationships. And these are all regularly updated, additional podcasts produced all the time to begin to develop, in effect, a library of things that would interest, I think, people like you and people watching. Finally, we also have a store at our website, democracyatwork.info store, and you can get there all kinds of lovely things, some of which, of course, you will want to give to your mother. Okay, which is soon, because that's why I brought it up. All right. I want to do a few quick updates on things that I think are important and that some of you have asked me about before we turn to the topic for tonight, which is socialism and what is happening, why is it coming back, and what does all that mean. The first thing, because it's so hot literally today, are some comments about this quote-unquote trade war between the United States and China. Over the weekend, we were supposedly had been told by our president, among other things, that things were working out and we were heading towards an agreement. And then on Sunday, he did 100 tweets or whatever it is he did, and said, "Oh no, it's terrible. They've gone back on their word," or whatever words he used. And then the stock market the last couple of days tanked as everybody's getting nervous. And he threatened to raise tariffs a great deal more on Friday of this week, so in 2 days. The Chinese then this morning officially announced that if he did that, they would retaliate with tariffs, which is what they did already the first couple of times that this was done. And so now we are facing the risk of some sort of ongoing conflict between the United States and China. It is still the best bet, as best I can tell, and most who would look at it, that all of this is about 80 to 90% political theater, undertaken by Mr. Trump, because he's the one who's initiated all of this. The Chinese reluctantly do the tit for tat, but all the initiative, you should all be aware that all the initiative here is coming from the United States, Mr. Trump, the Republicans, and the Democrats, who are extraordinarily quiet about all of this. If they're opposed, there's hardly a word about it. So the Chinese are assuming, as is the rest of the world, that this is American policy, not just Mr. Trump. He might be doing it in a way that's the naughty boy, but that's his signature. That's how he does everything. He's going to do it that way here, too. So a few comments just to make sure you're all on the same page. First, Mr. Trump repeatedly says something about the tariffs, which is not only incorrect and wrong, but would get him to be flunked in any freshman course in economics. No, seriously. Even by the most right-wing professor wanting to help him would give him a C- at best. Here's what the mistake is. He keeps saying, he said it again this weekend, that the tariffs are a great thing because it's costing China billions of dollars to pay these tariffs that we're imposing on them. That's wrong. That's not a perspective. That's not a point of view. That's wrong. W-R-O-N-G, you flunk, wrong. Why? A tariff is just a tax. All that the word tariff means is a particular kind of tax. And it's a tax that you put on something when it comes into your country, crossing your border. So a tariff is like if you buy a European car made in Europe and it is shipped here, a tariff means when it arrives here, let's say it costs $20,000, this car from someplace. Now, the government of the United States requires the importer, the American company that imports, to pay a tax on that $20,000 car from Europe. It doesn't affect how much money the $20,000 car gets for the European who produced it. He produced it, he gets his $20,000 because that's his price. But we Americans have to pay the $20,000, the price of the car, plus the tax that our government puts on it. So the Chinese don't pay the tariffs, you do. And of course, it's not good for the president to say, I slapped them with a big tariff that costs you, because that doesn't come out right. So he says what he would like to be able to say. You know, like you'd like to be able to, at the end of this evening, go out, get in your Mercedes, and go home. But you don't have a Mercedes. And even if you tell yourself all night about how fun it'll be to get into your Mercedes, you kind of know when you're done tonight, no Mercedes. Mr. Trump doesn't live in a restricted world like that. So he thinks by saying it, all of us, all of you, all of the Americans will go, oh boy, he stuck it to the Chinese. He didn't. That's not what a tariff is or how it works. Okay? Number one. He repeats this crapola, and a large part of the media simply, a few do, but most of them don't register the utter absurdity of all of this. All right, number one. Number two, there are 8 million ways to get around a tariff. For example, the idea of the tariff is if you follow my example, it raises the price of that car. The car used to come in, $20,000 is what it cost. You paid $20,000. If you put a tariff on it, now it costs, let's say if it's a 10% tariff, it costs $22,000. The 20 it costs plus a $2,000 tariff. It costs Americans $22,000. Why is this interesting for an American company? Because there's an American company that makes a car just like it, for which it has to charge, ready? $21,000, because it's the only way it can make any profit off of it. But the problem is now, for a while, they can only make profit if they charge $21,000, making it here in America, and they're having a problem because you and I are not going to buy that car for 21 if we can get the equivalent from Europe for 20. So the American company goes to Washington, goes to Mr. Trump and says, hey, now watch what they say. Here's what they don't say. We stink at what we do. We can't produce a car for $20,000, not with love or the help of Almighty God. We can't. And so we are in trouble because everybody's buying the imported car for 20. Now, Mr. Trump, the only reason they can do it for 20 is, get ready, they're cheating. They're cheating. They don't really know how to make a good car for 20,000 that costs us 21. They're cheating. And that's not fair. So help us defeat these cheaters by slapping on a tariff. What company is going to go to Washington and say, help us make a profit even though we are less productive than the other guy, the imported guy? None of them are going to say that because you're not going to get very far with that. Help me, I'm unproductive. Doesn't sound good. Help me, I'm the victim of foreigners cheating. That sounds much better. And it's much better for the politician to be able to say, I gave a tariff because the other side is cheating. How do I know this? Because tariffs have been used as policy for at least the last 400 years. We have lots of experience. And here's what we learned if we spend any time at it. Every capitalist crook, and that's a large percentage, has at one time or another gone to a politician to get a tax that helps him. They've learned years ago how to do that, how to bribe and, donate to the politician, to get an ear, to tell a story. And then they pay the advertisers to say, we don't want help because we're inefficient and can't compete. No, we want help because the other side is cheating. If you believe that on the say-so of the companies that are getting the tariff, you need help. You're being played with. And you shouldn't make it easy for people that play with you in that way, especially when in the end, it's your money that is being removed from your wallet to pay for all of this. The notion, repeated every day, the Chinese have gone back on what they do. The Chinese are subsidizing their enterprises. Cheating, in other words. Second point, everybody cheats. Everybody cheats. Let me give you some examples. When the state of Arkansas decided to build certain roads to certain factories that were being constructed so that they would have an easier time, trucks getting into the factory with the inputs and trucks coming out with the export. That made it possible for that company to lower the price because they didn't have the difficulties of transportation they used to have. That's a subsidy. They could then lower the price of whatever it is they were making because, in effect, the government had just subsidized them by building a very new, convenient road. The Chinese do, of course, the same thing. That's part of how countries compete with one another. Every capitalist in every country is constantly trying to get those kinds of benefits. Do you understand? There's a special program to allow, let's pick something where we can play the game. We want to help, here we go, ready? Retarded people. So the government is going to help retarded persons by getting them a job. You know how that's done? We're going to give the company that hires these persons a help. If the wage to be paid to them is $15 an hour, the government will pay $7.50. So the employer only has to pay $7.50. This is a piece of help to a community that needs it. Everybody feels good. That's a subsidy. That company can now lower the price of what it sells because its labor costs were just reduced through a governmental help. Last December, the government of Mr. Trump gave every business in America an enormous tax cut. That's called a subsidy. That makes it possible for them to lower the price and still be profitable because their taxes had just been cut. By the way, from 35 to 21%. That's a 40% tax cut. The Chinese could have, they didn't, but they could have gone into court, the World Trade Organization, and said, look, they're subsidizing. We didn't give our businesses a tax cut like that. It's true, they didn't. It's true the United States subsidized, but the Chinese didn't do it because everybody does that all the time. We would be in court all day long. Everywhere in the world, if we were trying to monitor that. All that these trade agreements do is limit, kind of say, look, do it, but don't do it too much. If you do it too much, we're going to make a stink about it, and it'll look bad for you, and then we'll go back to the normal amount of this, which is happening all the time. So then what is this all about? What this is about is a serious issue. And the serious issue is the United States, for the last 40 years, indulged the Chinese on exactly what is now no longer acceptable. You ought to ask yourself, why now? Are the Chinese doing something in the last 2, 3, 4 years that they didn't do in the last 30? No. They're doing exactly the same. And that was a basic deal. And it was as follows. We, the Chinese, and I'm going to come back to this later, we have a strategy for how to go from being a poor country to a rich one, which is what most of the world is busy interested in doing, like their number one priority. Okay, how are we going to do it? And they made a strategic decision. We are going to become the manufacturer of everything. We're going to succeed by doing what? We're going to produce everything the world now consumes, either better quality or more cheaply, or both. That's what, by the way, in setting out this strategy, they were like many countries who thought that would be a good plan. The difference is they did it. They succeeded brilliantly and in record time, 30 years, which for this kind of a project is very little. 40 years, 30 years, depending on how you count. Here's the deal they made to do this. They knew they could not do that without a lot more capital than they could generate in their own country. Number two, they knew they were far behind technologically what they needed to get to be able to do this plan. And number three, they could produce more effectively and they could produce more cheaply, but if they didn't have some way to get that distributed around the world, all of their success in manufacturing would go nowhere because they couldn't distribute. So they needed distribution help, capital, and technology. So they did the logical thing. They went to the West, to the developed capitalist world, United States, Western Europe, and Japan, above all. And they said, we offer you a deal. Here's what we need: a distribution system, technology, and capital. If you give us those things, here's what we'll give you. We'll give you a disciplined, hardworking labor force at a ridiculously low wage. Number one. Number two, we will give you the freedom to sell what you can produce with this low wage in China here in China. And we're the fastest growing market in the world. So we're going to give you cheap labor and a fantastic growth area for you. That's what you get. What we get is technology, capital, and a distribution system. Are you with me? So companies who didn't have to, nobody's holding a gun to their heads, American companies and British companies and Japanese companies jumped at the chance. Yes, they said, here's the capital, here's the technology, give us the laborers, give us the support infrastructure, and give us the access to your markets, which the Chinese did. Gave them all that. The deal was made. Tremendous profit for the companies that went to China and did this. They got out of it what they hoped for. And the Chinese got out of it what they hoped for. It was a successful capitalist deal. Distribution was, of course, arranged as is only proper, by the Walmart Corporation, which became the #1 partner for the People's Republic of China. Why? Because Walton said, the Walmart, we will distribute whatever you make into every corner of the United States, out-competing whatever other company, American, used to have its stuff on the Walmart shelf. Out in comes the Chinese stuff, often produced by the same American company that closed its facilities in the United States and opened them in China because they could pay workers so much less. You understand? China didn't steal the technology. China made a deal for the technology. To call it stealing now is like, I make a deal. I give you this, you give me that. And as soon as we're done, I tell the world that you took what I just paid you to get that. There's a nice game, but it requires stupid people to take it seriously. And none of you wants to think you could possibly be that. So it worked. But it worked way better than American policymakers thought it would, because the Chinese were very careful. They gave the foreign companies a chance, but they held on. They learned the technology. When they could do it themselves. They didn't need the American company. The American companies weren't stupid. They knew what they were getting into. Nobody played any games because there are none to be played here. The problem is the Chinese did it much better and much faster than anyone expected. So now suddenly, here they are, the fast-growing economic system that is now #2 after the United States. Now, final point about that #2, which I did with you a month ago, but I can see from the number of people who still have a hard time with this. 2 basic statistics. 1, over the last 25, 30 years, the average growth of output every year, that's the GDP, percentage growth of GDP, that's what economists use to kind of measure how well an economy is going. The average growth rate in China over the last 25 years, 10 to 11% a year. The average growth rate in the United States over that period, 3. Do you understand? That's one line going like this, and the other line going like this, and as this one comes up and this one's going this way, they're gonna cross. The United States is being caught up by the Chinese. They're not even, this year, which is the slowest year in many in China, the economy is growing, 2018, the last year, 6.4%. United States, 2.9%, depending on how you count, maybe 3. So in a bad year, China is growing more than twice as fast. Now the one that's even more important, real wages. What are real wages? That's the money wage an average worker gets, adjusted for the price he or she has to pay. So it's a measure of how much you can really afford to get in the way of goods and services for whatever you get paid. The average real wage in the United States today is roughly what it was in the middle of the 1970s. We have not had an increase in real wages for 40 to 50 years. That the working class of the United States has accepted this is the single most important political problem of this country, and it has been for a long time. It's a challenge to you and me to figure out how the power in this society was able to get that to be accepted by all of us. Well, we know some of the ways it was done, which is, you give it away with your faces right now. You didn't know. Okay, that's a good way. The second way was to allow American workers to keep consuming more, even though their wages weren't going anywhere, which is called debt. Your mortgage, your car, your credit card, your college education. You are up to here in debt. Here's the beauty of it. By not raising your wages for 40 years, while you became more and more productive, profits went crazy. Because you remember, if your productivity goes up per worker, it means what you give to the employer for every hour you work goes up. Your real wage is what he gives you, which went nowhere. If you're giving more and more to the employer, and he's giving you the same, that's going to make him richer. And you, not at all. which is why the inequality in our country gets nuts. There's no mystery here. The only mystery is why the working class accepted it. Here's the best part. When the American working class gave up on getting wages and took debt instead, who the hell you think lent them the money? The employers, because they had all the profits and you didn't require higher wages and you kept making more and more for them. They took the money that they didn't pay you in wages and lent it to you. You idiot. It really is. It's as if at the end of the week I said, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a wage like I used to. Here's a loan for the same amount. Better, I'll give you a little extra. You used to get 100, I'll give you 120. It's a loan, you see. So you're going to have to pay it back to me, and you're going to have to pay me interest. Other than that, it's sort of like a wage, only it isn't. And if you say thank you and go home, then it's going to happen next week too, and the week thereafter. But it's been going on for 40 years.
The boss has said if you want a raise, I'll go and close the factory and go to China.
Absolutely, and enough of them did it to make it a credible threat. Last thing, though, the statistic. So the real wage in America is flat. Millions of families over these last 40 years, you know how they made do? It wasn't just with borrowing. It was also sending the women out to work in families that didn't do that before, which is not so much the people of color. It's more the white people whose women stayed home, by and large. But those women had to go in. In order for the family to function when the wages went nowhere for 40 years, women had to learn how to no more stay at home, go to work just like the husband, come home just as tired, and for roughly 50%, get divorced. Because that's a very hard adjustment. Seriously, that's a very hard adjustment. This is not a comment on whether it's good or bad. It's a very hard adjustment and was forced on the American working class because they bought this absurd deal. Over the last 25 years, really hold on to this number, over the last 25 years that the real wage in America was flat. What happened to the real wage, the average wage of a Chinese worker? Ready? Real wage, not the money adjusted for prices. It quadrupled. It went up by 400%. Do you understand? The Chinese government is a hero in China, just as it would be here if the last 40 years had to deliver to you a quadrupling of the average real wage. There's no contest here. Do you understand? That's why this theater has to be performed. Because it's too blunt, it's too gross, the difference. By the way, it's a poorer country than we are, so they grew fast, but they grew from a low base. So you can still say, gee, the Chinese are poorer than we are. Absolutely. But wow, is that accordion going like this? The difference is shrinking. This year, the average wage in China will be roughly equal to that in Portugal and Greece. They're catching up fast. They're not that picture from the National Geographic of 20 years ago. No, that's over. And that's not coming back. Nor is the dominance of the United States. And part of what you're seeing in this whole theater is the desperate recognition of the United States that it may now be what they can do. Too little and too late. They waited too long. But the danger, and I mean this really seriously, this will not be the first time that a country seeing its dominance threatened this way resorts in the end to war. War with China, war with Iran as a side way to get into and disrupt the Silk Road projects that you know about and the Chinese are undertaking. Very serious stuff. And since you have a literally loose cannon in the White House, World War I was started not in a fight between the British and the Germans, who were the main adversaries, or the United States or Britain or Russia, by an obscure aristocrat in a place called Serbia that no one knew or cared about. Somebody, he was riding down the road in a coach and someone killed him. And the next thing we knew, we had World War I. So it can start anywhere. Pick a place. I don't know, Venezuela. I don't know, Israel, Palestine. I don't know, fill in the blank. The opportunities are everywhere. Okay, quick 2 or 3 others. Number 1, on May 1st, the House of Commons in England declared a national climate change emergency. It is not, there's a conservative government dominates the House of Commons. The Labour Party is the minority party. So the Conservatives, the Labour supported it, but the Conservatives and Labour together, climate change is a threat to the entire survival of Great Britain, and we must now do, it's not clear what the results of this will, but it's an extraordinary verbal commitment of the government, the entire government, to deal with this as a national emergency. At the same time that this is happening in Britain, in the United States, the government acts like there is nothing there. That none of this is an issue. None of this need to concern anybody. I just want you to deal with these levels of dichotomy. In its way, that is as gross a difference between this country and another part of the world as is the difference between real wages in America and real wages in the People's Republic of China. I don't always want to be seen as telling stories in which the working class wins. If some of my fellow leftists feel the need to only talk about when labor wins, which always then leaves the question, if we're always winning, why are we in such bad shape? So I feel it requires sometimes to talk about when we don't. And it's really sad for me, I don't know about any of you, but in the United States, we have a very sad situation with classical music. Most of our cities and towns have no classical music. Any of you who have ever traveled through Italy, you'll know that every town has an opera. It's part of the culture there. It's just a different situation. But we don't in the United States. We require that if you want to have a symphony orchestra and play that kind of music in your community, you have to rely on very rich people to endow a foundation. You know, like the New York Philharmonic, and they will then build a palace of celebration of their wealth, you know, like Lincoln Center, that has Charles Koch, or Koch, or however you pronounce his name. Help me, how do you pronounce his name? Koch. I can see you have to be careful with that, sorry. Koch, of course, yes. Anyway, so that's how we do. If you know, either you don't have any symphony, which is screw you, or you have one that is brought to you by wealthy people. Wealthy people, that's a euphemism, corporate people, and they have, based on what they do with their businesses, an attitude towards labor like, get rid of it. Why have it? They're all greedy, they don't work hard, they want to spend their life in the bathroom, they're drunk, or whatever, you know. So this creates a disconnect, because the workers in a symphony, you know, are the violinists and the tuba players and the drummers and the trumpeters and the clarinetists and all the others. They are musicians who probably love their instrument. They've spent a lifetime becoming great at it and so forth. So it was sad to see a strike this spring by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, one of the greatest orchestras, for those of you that know something about classical music, it's one of the great orchestras of the world, and one of the 4 or 5 best here in the United States, and has been for decades, a long time. The entire orchestra went on strike. The conductor, Riccardo Muti, a very important conductor in the world, also supported the strike, and most of the people who go to the symphony supported the strike. But the chair of the Chicago Symphony Board turns out to be the wife, a woman named Helen Zell, who is the wife of a man named Sam Zell. Sam Zell is a real estate tycoon, you know, like Trump. And he has lots of buildings, and he's worth a ton of money. Well, I was about to say like Trump, but given this morning's New York Times, not Trump, not Trump. Mr. Zell has actually made money and paid taxes, whereas Mr. Trump hasn't done either of those things. Okay. And they were tough. They let them walk. They let them miss a whole bunch of concerts. But the musicians held firm. They stayed out on strike, they went out on strike. During the time of the strike, the graduate students at the University of Illinois in Chicago also had a strike, and the musicians joined the picket line of the students and vice versa. There was some nice labor solidarity. But then in came, to resolve this problem, the mayor of Chicago, a man named Rahm Emanuel. And he immediately fixed it all, so the workers were defeated. The symphony won. The workers lost their defined pension benefit. That was the single most important issue. What's the issue? That there would be a reasonable pension at the end of the 30 years that an average musician gave to playing in the orchestra for the people, that he or she would not be in trouble when they retired. This clearly, for these billionaires, was an outrageous benefit that they had been enjoying for the last 30 years, and so with real resolve, they got rid of that. That strike was defeated. And that led me to do some research, whereupon I discovered that in 2016, the Pittsburgh Symphony went on strike, and after many weeks, it was required to go back to work with significant concessions, which included a 7% pay cut in the first year and the loss of their defined pension plan. In 2013, the San Francisco Symphony went on strike. They were able to get a 4.5% pay raise, but they had at the same time to pay a significantly larger portion of their health insurance, which left them effectively no better off. And in the end, in Minneapolis in 2012, likewise, the lockout there lasted for 488 days. There's only 365 in a year, so they were out for more than a year. The loss of an entire season, the quitting of their music director, the quitting of a number of their players. When they finally went back to work, they accepted a contract that meant they would not reach the level of pay they had gotten in 2012 again until 2020. In other words, their salary was frozen until next year at the level it had been as of 2012. Then it's a small number of people, they're musicians, they play in symphony orchestras. They just got really screwed. And they got screwed by a combination of corporations and the politicians the corporations put in office. Should be real clear who's doing the work. By the way, the first one I told you about, Chicago Symphony, has an endowment, that's wealth that they own, of $300 million plus a $60 million investment fund. The notion that they could not afford to pay the 70 or whatever musicians it was a decent pension, I mean, I leave to your notion of what is or isn't reasonable. Okay, let's now deal with the topic, socialism. Socialism is back in the news. That should be a source of interest, I hope, to most of you. Coming on pretty strong. And it proves the old remark that is attributed to Mark Twain. Mark Twain lived most of his life in Hartford, Connecticut, 2 or 3 hours from here. And one day he got up in the morning in Hartford and he picked up the morning newspaper and read with a considerable amount of interest an obituary for Mark Twain. And then picked up a letter and wrote this short letter to the editor. Reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. The demise of socialism has been predicted so many times that it's kind of boring to remind you that this is again evidence that this is not going away, this socialism. It hasn't for a couple of centuries, and it's not about to. So whatever else in the way of emotions you have greeting its return, it should not be surprise. It really never was a question of whether, it was only ever a question of when. And that when is more appropriate to the United States than almost any other place on earth. Socialism is accepted in most of the countries of the world as a political point of view shared by large numbers of people, influencing magazines, television stations. They have socialist political parties, usually more than one, etc., etc., etc. The United States has been unusual in the sense that after World War II, a war during which we were allied with the Soviet Union against Germany and Japan. They were our allies, these socialists. In the aftermath of that, as the rules changed and the game changed, and the ally became the enemy, and the former enemy became the ally, it was necessary, since if you change the outfits real quick, it's hard to see who's on whose team, it became necessary to really beat it into the American people who the new good guys and bad guys were in the world. So the United States became the location of the good guys and socialism in Russia to begin with, because that was the main issue, was the bad guy. And the bad guy could not be painted in colors bad enough, and the good guy could not be painted in colors good enough. This is an environment in which rational conversation, even rational thought, becomes very difficult. You can't look at, you can't ask questions, because the very posing of them runs you the risk of being labeled disloyal, ignorant, evil, or all of that. And that's not a pleasant place to be, especially if the government hounded you, fired you, deported you, which it did in the years after 1946 in the United States. So we come at this with a particular history. So do bear with me if I lop back and forth into the analysis of socialism and the history, because they really have to be dealt with together. So let's begin. Socialism is the other, if I can use a psychological language, of capitalism. It's capitalism's shadow. It's capitalism's criticism. More exactly, it's capitalism's self-criticism. Capitalism, like every economic system, always produces people who like it and people who don't. That was true of slavery, that was true of feudalism, that was true of every economic system we know of, just as it's true of pretty much every kind of system. Transportation system, education system, family system. There are people who think the family is a fantastic, wonderful institution, and other people who want to get as far away from it as they possibly can. And I'm sure many of you fall somewhere in a little bit of both camps, at least at some days and some months and some years of your life. So the notion that socialism is somehow alien, that makes exactly as much sense as being very angry at your shadow. You can get as angry as you want, but that's part of you. Given the sun and the light and your body, you're going to have a shadow. More obvious sometimes than others, but it's part of you. Socialism has always been part of capitalism. Being surprised that socialism surges is exactly the same as being surprised that when the light goes into a certain direction, oh my goodness, I got a shadow. Where were you all your life? You've always had that. What is socialism? Well, let's start really simple. It's a yearning. It's a dream. It's a hope. And what is it for? You know that already. It's for equality. It's for freedom. It's for democracy. It's for community. The idea of socialism is we don't want a society in which, here we go, a few individuals are dominant, are wealthy, and the rest of us aren't. That's not a healthy community. We want a community where we are all roughly equal parts of it. The capitalist world even gives lip service to that stuff. In religious language, we're all equal in the eyes of God. We're all equal. Not some more, equal. Right? We want freedom. Well, it's not just freedom from this or that political, we want freedom from economic misery, from poverty, from want. Of course we do. We want a community. The idea that there's something wrong with capitalism was always linked to the notion that it positions some individuals in a radically different position than others. And to protect that, to justify it, to rationalize it on the notion that the individual should be free is making out that that pig is a dog. It's a pig. This is not about being free to be yourself. It's about being free to be in a very different position from all your fellow citizens. That's why the word social, you ever wonder? Capitalism defines economic socialism. Well, socialism is the opposite of individualism. So why would that word? Because it was about society. It was the notion that the individual gets his or her everything by virtue of the environment, the society in which the individual grows. To sustain the individual, you've got to sustain the community. If you don't, if you allow individuals to be in radically different positions, the quality and the development of your community is going to be very different than if you make them more or less equal. Doesn't mean everybody gets the same amount of money. That'd be mechanical and silly. But it has to do with a sense of community. And if you're worried that a community can't be sustained if it has a small number of individuals who are very rich and a large number of people who aren't, you're right. That's been a recipe for trouble always. So socialism is that kind of abstract, vague, utopian dream of a society that doesn't have the ugly qualities that the capitalism seemed to have to a lot of people living in it. That's why the earliest socialists existed in the 17th century, if not earlier. And despite all the efforts of the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century, here we are in the 21st century, and it still bothers us. Of course it does. It's there because of what capitalism is. Capitalism produces and reproduces its own critics, as every system always did. Okay, there was this wonderful line of Marx's, that socialism, the condition of each individual's development is the condition of the community's development. We want a society in which each individual can develop, each, not some, each can realize his or her full potential by virtue of a nurturing community that makes that possible and is committed to that. That's the idea. How to realize that, how to achieve it, that's been the big problem. But the dream and the idea have been there all along. So let's start with the 19th century, which is really where it gets going, the modern form of socialism. And I'm going to talk about it mostly in the United States, because that's where we are, but with some references to others. The first signs, you might say, of socialism here, not talking about the native community, where there are very interesting, for those of you who know a little bit about it, the Iroquois, that famous phrase that some of you think was invented by Hillary Clinton, it takes a village to raise a child. That comes from Native American culture, where the children were literally raised by the village, not by the particular biological people who produced the child. But putting that aside, partly because of my ignorance, I don't know very much about it, other than to know that there were lots of interesting examples there. The first one is one that I've mentioned in these meetings before because they're still around and you can see them. The Shakers, up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. If you ever go up there, a couple of hours from here, they still have their community. They were part of colonial America. They had a system that was socialist. Everybody who worked there had an equal role to play. Everybody earned equally. Everybody had an equal say in all the decisions made about what to produce, how to produce, where to produce. It was a socialized community. It took everybody who came in. The people who came to the Shakers were mostly women running away from abusive family. They would come with their children. They could go nowhere else in colonial society, given the position of women in that society, but they could come to the Shaker communities, which without a word would take them in, providing them food, clothing, shelter, daycare for their children, the whole business, integrating them into their community. There were no battered women's shelter, that was what the Shakers did, which was the only way they survived, because if you know anything about Shakers, they're called that because their religious ceremonies were literally shaking themselves Sunday mornings. This had something to do with the fact that they did not believe in and prohibited sex, which apparently led to an excess of certain kinds of energy, which apparently shaking can release. Nobody get up, please. Just stay where you are. Okay. The first socialist political party in the United States, 1877. So we're not that long into it. Was called, by the way, the Socialist Labor Party here in the United States. Was the first time people came together and had the idea that socialism is something we need to create out of and to go beyond capitalism, and we're going to make a political party to do it. But I want you to understand, it's old. It's 1877, okay? In that period, after the Civil War, socialism grew very quickly, not just in the United States, but in England, in Germany, and elsewhere. It really took off, this idea of socialism. I'm going to come to a little bit later what exactly it meant. I want you to understand that it got to the point here in the United States very quickly that the call came, we need a socialist president. In 1916, for the first time, a candidate ran for the presidency of the United States, a man by the name of Allen Benson, the first socialist candidate for president. He got, in that year of the election, 600,000 votes, which worked out to 3% of the total vote cast. Okay? 4 years later, 1920, again, the Socialist Party of the United States ran a candidate for president. His name is better known, Eugene Victor Debs, and he got 900,000 votes. In other words, the vote went up by 50% in those 4 years, and that worked out to 4% of the total vote in that year. Then 4 years later, 1924, another socialist candidate, but by this time, given American politics, which had turned violently against socialism, led by the Republican and Democratic parties, this socialist made a strategic decision, this should sound familiar to you, not to run on the Socialist Party name. He ran on the Progressive Party label. He formed the Progressive Party and ran. His name was Robert La Follette from Wisconsin. And in 1924, he got 5 million votes. It went up 5 times in those 4 years, and that worked out to 17% of the total presidential vote in that year. That is a growth of political support that deserves the adjective astronomical. 600,000, 900,000, 5 million. 3%, 4%, 17%. Try to imagine, with that track record over 3 presidential elections, what might have been possible had the socialists continued to be able to function in the United States as a political tendency. We'll never know, because this country turned and squashed them with everything it knew how to do, which is the story of the last 100 years. 1924, we're 5 years from that now. 100 years. One phase from about the time of the Russian Revolution, 1917, until the 1930s, the Great Depression, and then again from 1945, we're still in it. Wow. What happened here? Socialism was good. By the way, this growth in the United States was not exceptional. The same thing was happening in England. The same thing was happening in Germany. By the beginning of the 20th century, the number 2 political party in Germany was the Socialist Party. 50 years earlier, there hadn't been one. But by the beginning of the 20th century, they were number 2. And they were fast gaining. The expectation was they would win, and nobody understood what would happen in Germany, because at this time, Germany still had a Kaiser, a king-type figure. They didn't have what they had later. World War I, when they were defeated, the Kaiser abdicated, but that was later than the time I'm telling you about. Okay. The 1917 revolution changed everything in Russia, because here was the first time that the socialists took over. It was notable because it was the first of that. It was also notable because they didn't do it by winning election majorities. They did it because Russia entered World War I as a very poor, backward country, collapsed, lost the war, had the war fought on its territory. The economy was destroyed, the society was destroyed, and in that moment, the Tsar, that's the Russian word for Kaiser in German, the Tsar, was pushed aside. I was about to say abdicated. It was messier than that. The German left. The Russian was separated. Parts of his body were removed, and other parts. It was a mess. And they took over with a revolution. And that made them the terror of the rest of the capitalist world, because what they were seeing beginning to happen everywhere else had now, in a sense, leapfrogged over into realization. And the thing about the Russian Revolution to understand is it had all the power and all the problems of being the first at anything. If you're the first one, then you have to do it on your own. You have no model, you have no lesson, you have no teacher. What do? What do Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, the leaders of this revolution, what do they do the day after they take over? You don't know? They didn't either. They had no idea what to do. Everything was slapdash, trial and error, but it was worse. The hatred of the rest of the capitalist world was such that immediately after the revolution, a civil war breaks out inside Russia. The White Army and the Red Army defending the new revolution, the White Army fighting against it. To give you an idea of a poor, backward, war-ravaged country now plunged into a civil war, the way to understand that is to see what's going to happen in the next few weeks and months in Venezuela. Comparable, as it already is. In that civil war, devastation on top of devastation. At about the same time that the Civil War breaks out, 4 capitalist countries are so horrified that they send troops into Russia to work with the White Army to overthrow the government. Japanese, French, English, and American. 10,000 American troops sent overseas invaded the Soviet Union. For my American audiences, I have to say that again. Did the Soviet Union ever invade the United States? No. Did the United States ever invade the Soviet Union? Yes. You can dance up and down. You can pretend. You can join many, many Americans in this pretense. But what I just told you, you can verify in any history book. To the surprise of everybody, including Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, they won, we lost. The foreign troops had to be withdrawn. The Civil War was over. The Red Army, led by Mr. Trotsky, won. Again, the problem, well, what do we do? What do we do? No, we won. We're in charge. The great leader of that period of time, Lenin, but he's not leader very long. The revolution is in 1917. By 1922, he has a brain aneurysm, and he dies the next year. He's gone. So they're a country without their charismatic leader. A fight begins between Stalin and Trotsky very quickly. Who's going to be next? But neither of them had this stature. Some of you want to get a sense of what all this meant. I've recently been reading the poetry of probably the most important African-American poet in American history, a man named Langston Hughes. Some of the greatest poetry about Lenin and the importance of Lenin was written by Langston Hughes. So if you're ever interested in getting a feeling for what the Russian Revolution, so far away in a different culture, what kind of powerful meaning it had for a Harlem resident Langston Hughes writing his poetry, then get his poetry and look up the poems to Lenin. There's several of them. They're extraordinary. And you had this around the world. The Russians had this fantastic, we did it. We are now gonna, ready, construct socialism. We have defeated capitalism. Everything they did became then the focal point. People who liked what happened in Russia said, yep, that's socialism, that's how you build it, and that's what we socialists in the rest of the world have to do, support this. This is like the first nurturant, the little baby that has to be raised so it can be replicated elsewhere in the world. Other socialists looked at this and said, oh, we don't like what's going on here. This is not what we understood socialism would look like. It turns out that people disagreed who were socialists about this first socialist experiment. And in fact, if you ever have the time and go back and look at the tradition, you'll discover that socialism has always been, from the beginning, a tradition with multiple different perspectives that have argued with one another and disagreed. There is nothing new about that. There is nothing unique about that. People who like capitalism also disagreed with each other. One of the allies of the United States is Saudi Arabia. They proudly endorse capitalism. They are a proud capitalist society who happens to butcher journalists. If you want, you could take Saudi Arabia as your example of capitalism and draw a line. In Saudi Arabia, capitalist, journalism butchered. And you could say, see, capitalism kills journalists. That would be about the same as saying Mr. Maduro in Venezuela repeats the word socialist a lot. 80% of enterprises in Venezuela right now are privately owned and operated. But he says social, okay. But on Fox News every night, socialism is Venezuela. You're to have your attitude towards Venezuela be shaped by whatever your attitude is to Mr. Maduro in Venezuela, if you even have the time to figure out what's going on down there. It's strange. It's not a sign of a problem in socialism, it's a sign of health. Lots of people are interested in socialism, and they don't all see it the same way. They argue with one another. And the development of socialism has been shaped in part by the disagreements they've had. Some perspectives were adopted by many, others were not. Some views that people had shared, a lot of people shared them, then changed over time and they had it different. So it was about the Soviet Union. People disagreed. But it was the first one, and so those disagreements hardened. And for a while, the following things happened. The disagreements kind of calmed down. There weren't many different points of view. There were 2 or 3. And here's how they looked. And this is the socialism we've inherited. Number one, there were the people who thought the Soviet Union was the leader. The Soviet Union had showed us how to do it. Lenin was the great teacher, and after him, Stalin, who was the next one. And to show that they were unique and different and had a different point of view from the socialists who didn't like what was happening in socialism, these socialists decided to call themselves a different name. And they took the name communist. That's where it comes from. There were no communist parties, basically, before about 1920. That's when they all formed. Before that, they were all socialist parties because they were different interpretations of socialism. It was to drive home that supporting the Soviet Union was a kind of marker that led some to say, if you support the Soviet Union, if that's your understanding, if that's how you see it, you're now a communist party person, not a socialist party person. The socialist parties kept on holding their name. They kept right on going. And you had a split in almost every country. Certainly had one here in the United States. But in most countries, the socialists were people who I'm going to explain to you in a minute what their view was, but they were separate from the Communist Party. In some countries, the Communist Party remained small, the Socialist Party big. In other countries, other way around. In still other countries, they were roughly parallel. People split. Even today in most European countries, if you go there and you ask people what's the difference between the socialists and the communists, they will explain it to you because they've had socialist and communist parties in their town, on their newspapers, on their television. They know exactly what it is. You go to an American audience and say, what's the difference between socialism and communism? They will tell you about the spelling. Because it's basically a synonym. They wouldn't know. My students ask me, I teach at the New School, my students ask me, what is the difference? Very honest, they have no idea. No idea. One of the fruits of an American education is you have no clue. Because you don't get it in school and you don't have them big enough in the society to teach you that way. Okay? Even the communists then split into two. Those who were really 100% loyal to Russia, and then those, and they followed Stalin because he was the next leader, and those who followed the one who didn't get to be the next leader, Mr. Trotsky. And we had a big split between what was sometimes called Stalinist communists versus Trotskyite communists. And those are fading now, but they're still around, those distinctions, and they mean something to the people, particularly older people who've been through the debates and the struggles about them. But those were then, for a while, those were it. You were either a socialist or a communist, Trotskyite, Stalinist. That was it. There wasn't much else. What was the difference? Well, here's really interesting because this is what socialism meant to all these people. Number one, businesses, enterprises are not to be privately owned. Not private citizens run the store or the factory or the office. Instead, the government is to take over and run them for the community as a whole rather than for the private profit of the individuals who own and run it. So it becomes, the language they used, socialized. We socialize the means of production. We make them the common property of the community managed by the government, which represents the community as a whole. That's the first thing. The second thing, we don't allow the distribution of resources and products to be done by the market. None of this, I'll give you 3 of my oranges, you give me 2 of your shirts. The government will plan the distribution to make it equitable, to give us all an equal shot. The market, after all, allocates whatever is scarce to the people with the most money to bid for it. That's what a market is. If there are 3 ice cream cones and 50 of you want it, how's this going to get worked out? Well, the one of you with the most money says, what's the ice cream cone cost? $3. Okay, I'll offer you 12. Whoa, a whole bunch of people can't buy. So they drop out. But there's a bunch. It's not 50 anymore, it's only 20. The one with the most money out of the 20, I'll offer you 100. That drops out. You see it keeps rising until there's only 3 people left with the money. So a market always allocates things, scarce things, whatever's scarce, to the people with the most money. That's why it's always been easy for socialists, once they get a chance, to look around the community and say, are all of you comfortable with making the distribution of scarce items go to the people with the most money? So let's see, if there's not enough milk to raise the children in our community, will it go to the person with the most money who gives it to his cat? Or will we, for most people, they wilt at that. They don't have any defense. Whatever they were taught in college about the efficiency of a market doesn't stand up real well against the concrete question, does it? And ditto the private ownership of the means of production. How are you going to defend that? Mr. Bezos owns the block of shares of Amazon. He has $150 billion. He doesn't know what to do with it. How could you? Meanwhile, the Minneapolis, Minnesota Symphony was out for 488 days for an amount of money that would have taken from Mr. Bezos the equivalent of my reaching into your pocket and taking 2 pennies right out. But it didn't get solved in this culture. So the socialists said, these kinds of issues mean, here we go now, that the government should step in and control the capitalist economy, not let it operate on its own. Make sure that this capitalist economy serves social goals. I want you to think about this because I'm describing to you something that's 100 years old. It was not invented, neither by Bernie nor by AOC. And I admire and support them 100%. There's not that. But I want you to get, this is old, what they are proposing. Very old. The government should step in. For example, don't let the market decide what the wages are of workers, because the market, with those capitalists, they'll stick it to the workers. You know what we're going to do? We're going to pass a minimum wage law. You can't pay anybody less than this because it's indecent. Here's another thing socialists were interested in: outlawing child labor. 100 years ago, millions of children in America, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, were working in sweatshops here in New York, a lot of them. Capitalists explain, you can't do away with that. That's where our profit is. We get away paying these kids nothing. That didn't sound good, so they revised that after consulting an ad firm. These are poor children. They come from poor families. And if we don't hire them and pay them, those families will be even poorer. We're helping them. A lot of Americans bought that, but not enough. And so eventually laws were passed, no more child labor. We don't care. Socialists have always fought for those things called reforms. They want to reform capitalism, to make it a humane system, to make it a system that serves people. The communists, that other kind of socialists, scoffed at all of this. Their argument was, that won't work. Those capitalists will figure out how to get around. You make a reform, they'll figure out how to get around it. They can't hire children in New York, and they'll hire them in Indonesia, which is what they did. Which is why you can afford sneakers, which you otherwise couldn't afford. Because we can't have Americans make sneakers. It's too expensive. So we have children in other parts of the world, in Bangladesh, make sneakers, or underpants, or gloves, or whatever. You do know. So the communists would come and say, this is inadequate, this mealy-mouthed socialism. You fight like crazy for the reform, but the capitalist will get around it, and if he's strong enough, he'll repeal it, and if he's really strong, he'll act like it's not there. He'll buy the politician, get it fixed. You can't leave the capitalist enterprise in the hands of the capitalists. That's your problem, you reformist socialists. You got to be a communist. You got to take the enterprise away from the private capitalist. That's how you make them play by the rules, because it's your own rules and you now own the enterprise. So in Russia and China and places where the communists were strong, they took over the enterprise. That way they could make sure that they behaved properly, that didn't use their profits to undermine whatever reforms had been achieved. But here's what was interesting about both of them, and where I need to take this in the time that I have. Both of them, both the socialists and the communists, despite some early efforts they did make, basically gave up. They gave up on transforming the workplace itself. They kept the focus, because they were the first ones, they were trying to figure it out. They kept the focus on socializing the means of production, giving the government a fantastically new, powerful role, and overcoming the market system with government planning, telling who's going to get how much of what. So they didn't transform the workplace. The socialists didn't, for example, in Western European countries, where socialism is very strong, and always has been for most of the last 75 years. Again, just so you know, 10 days ago there was an election in Spain. The winner was the Socialist Party. So the government of Spain is the socialist government. Next door to Spain is Portugal. In Portugal, for 3 years, they've had a government. It's a coalition of 3 parties. The leading party is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second part of the coalition is the Portuguese Communist Party. You're going to get nervous now. And the third one is the Portuguese Green Party. It's a socialist, communist, green coalition. Portugal's doing real well. Real well. Better than most of the other parts of Europe. Merkel has been, you wouldn't know it in the United States, but Merkel has been in a coalition with the Socialist Party in Germany for years. She can't govern by herself because she doesn't get enough votes. She has to make a coalition, and she's made it with the socialists. You can wonder why the socialists did that, but you can see why she did it. She's Mrs. Merkel. And enjoy that with her because she's got, at best, a few months left of being the leader. I'm not talking about, nor am I making any threat whatsoever. Okay, so neither in the communist world nor in the socialist world was the transformation of the workplace ever included. And this meant something really important. It meant that the 20th century, which everyone in this room is a product of, that the 20th century became a century in which a battle took place between one thing that was called capitalism and another thing that was called socialism/communism. The thing called capitalism was private enterprises, markets, with a little bit of government control. United States, Western Europe, sort of, Japan. And aligned against it, the other was socialism/capitalism. Socialism, well, that's Scandinavia, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, those places. And then the communist kind of socialists. And by the way, they called themselves socialists, just for the record. The party was called communist. It wanted to go to communism. But they never thought they had arrived at it. The only people who thought they arrived at communism were the West, who hated them. They called their country socialist. In China, they didn't even call it socialist. They call it a People's Republic, whatever the hell that means. The Russians call themselves USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Socialist. The notion that in the 20th century was communism is a notion invented by the New York Times. And people like that. Partly it's now because whatever that was defeated. And it would be really fun if what was defeated was communism. That's like hoping the shadow disappears until the next sunny day when, surprise, it shows up again. So what happened was a demonization of what then was understood to be socialism and communism. And what was that? The government taking over the enterprises and the government planning taking over the market. So the capitalists, to defeat socialism, went to work to demonize what? The government. When you listen to the right wing in America, what are you hearing? The demonization of the government. As if the government is the great enemy. The government is, here we go, socialism. That's why in parts of America, they don't like the post office. They don't want the post office because it's socialist. And why is that? The government. The government is evil. The government is bad. People blow up governments in this country because they're real upset. The government is terrible. I had a debate 2 weeks ago with a libertarian, and all he could do, the government. When I said, well, what's what big business? I hate them too. The government. It was an aside. The libertarians do. They hate big business controlling everything. For them, that's like a big government. They hate them. They want a free market. Talk about living in a utopian dream. They outdo all of us on the left, way better. They live in a whole nother universe of a free market, which they imagine is going to come one day right after Jesus. Or maybe I shouldn't, but with Jesus. With Jesus. Jesus brings the pork chops and the free market. Anyway, here's my punchline. The fight has been over the power of the government. The way you terrorized American working class people was to tell them socialism is the government telling you what to do. The government taking away your health care. Remember in the last year and a half? The government, you know, it's like your worst day in the post office when you stood online for an hour and a half and were abusively treated by the clerk who, in response to your request for stamps, made an insult to your mother. Right? This is awful. The government is horrible. And the capitalists are then your allies in keeping the government at bay. Go with Mr. Trump. He will deregulate, get the government out of your bed. Whoa. Genius, though. But here's the funny dialectic of it all. This clever way to mobilize large parts of the working class against socialism by rewriting it as the dominance of the government. That's why it's so important to talk about the dictatorship in the Soviet Union or in any socialist country. The dictatorship. Dictatorship. But here's the dialectic. Suppose socialism gets redefined by our generation. It's not so much about taking over the enterprises by the government. And it's not so much the government controlling or manipulating markets. It's a completely different image. It's about the transformation of your workplace. The 5 days of the week that you go to work, in your office, in your factory, in your store, you're now going to be part of what runs that enterprise. It's going to be your enterprise, and the community of people that work there. No bosses, you're your own boss. For many years, when I taught at the University of Massachusetts, I would begin each semester by handing out, I taught sometimes big classes with 400 or 500 students. And I would hand out a little piece of paper and I would say, write down what you hope to be doing 5 years after you graduate from this university. And the largest single answer, year after year, I would get from these nice middle and working class people of Massachusetts who went to that university was, I want to be my own boss. I don't want to work for anybody else. The sadness of that, their chance of doing that was right up there with winning the lottery. But it's what they wanted. And the irony, which I would try to teach them, the irony is their best shot at doing that would be a worker co-op. That's the only way they could possibly get there. Imagine if socialism meant not the government, but the transformation of your workplace so that everybody has 2 job descriptions, whatever particular task you do in the division of labor, plus your participation on the board of directors, which all workers collectively are. You are an employee, but you're also the employer. Collectively, you're the employer of each of you individually. You're a member of a community. You have communized the workplace. Welcome to communism, but now redefined, rethought. And the beauty of it is it does 2 things. It solves a mystery of what went wrong with the other socialisms and communisms. Why everything they tried to get, they lost or are losing. It's not just in this country that benefits are being taken away. In France, one of the reasons you have the Yellow Vest movement is the government is withdrawing things that the workers won before. Mr. President Macaroon, I think that's how you pronounce it, President Macaroon wants to change the labor laws in France to make it easier for employers to fire people. The same is being done in much of the rest of Europe. They're losing their socialist reforms. They are also losing a good bit of that already in Russia for years now, but in China, these things are also being fought over. The tragedy is, one of the reasons you lost it is you still left the workplace divided between a small number of people who make all the decisions and the rest of us. You call them state officials, you call them commissars, you call them whatever you want, but they're state officials and they're a small number, and the mass of people still come to work, do their business, and go home. Right? You'd never involved the mass of people in socialism was something far away in the capital city where they took over. I mean, you heard about it, you read about it, but did it transform the immediacy of your life? Not so much. Imagine a socialism that talked about what would affect you from the minute it starts, because you would have to create the new business as a worker co-op. You'd have to protect it. You'd have to reproduce it over time. You'd have to fight against whatever disrupted it or made it go backwards towards what capitalism was. And not the least of its advantages is, if that were the new definition, then 100 years of demonizing socialism would no longer matter. They would have demonized the wrong target. We then, as socialists, would be advocates of something that had nothing to do with the government. Has to do with the transformation of the workplace. And our enemies don't know how to deal with that because they never had to. They've been busy demonizing the state. That's the equivalent of having a bow and arrow and shooting the arrow in the wrong direction. We are not going to be at risk. They're not ready for this. We are, because it comes out of our own self-criticism as a socialist movement. Last point that I have time for. Sorry about that. Every surge of socialism has gone through the following steps. It starts with a demand to be better treated within the capitalist system. That's where people almost always start. The yellow vests in France, they didn't want a particular tax on fuel to pay for their ecological programs. The United States wanted to have a little bit better health insurance than the one it had. They don't question. But you know the resistance to that? The obstacles thrown in the way, the refusal to even talk about it, the attempt to demonize it like you've demonized everything else, that makes a significant number of these people who are formed, they get angry, they get bitter. They start asking, why is this opposite? What I'm asking for is perfectly reasonable. The majority of people want better health insurance. It's supposed to be a government that responds to what the majority of people want. Well, what's the issue here? Well, something's blocking it. Well, what is that? Then come the people who say it's the system. It isn't this or that. It's a system. Well, who talks about that? Well, these socialists, they say capitalism is a system, makes all this crap. Socialism would avoid all this crap. Ooh, then they start reading about that. Then they try to find, if they've got mental curiosity and they're being pushed, who's got the kind of best way of putting all this together? And that's when they encounter Marx and Marxism, because that's what that is. Marx was the theorist. He came along and put a lot of impulses and ideas that had been partially formed, developed. He was dependent on all of them, but he put them together, just like Adam Smith had been dependent on lots of insights of pamphleteers and others who came before him, but he kind of put it together, Mr. Smith. And Mr. Ricardo, right after him, fixed up some of the things, the loose ends that Smith did. Just like Marxists after Marx worked on a lot of the loose ends he left. And that's the most developed critical tradition, which is why Marxism is everywhere in the world, because everywhere there were people, some more, sometimes less, who went that extra distance to try to figure out what is it about this system that makes it work this way. We are on that path. Bernie is part of that path. AOC is part of that path. The 6, by the way, for those of you who don't know, 6 socialists now sit on the city council of Chicago, out of a city council of 50 members. 6. And all the recent elections have, and more of that is coming. And these are not all the same. These socialists already, if you listen to them and talk to them, they already begin to show you the different tendencies I've already talked to you about. It's the shadow coming back, big time. Only this time it's not on the United States in its ascendant period, when it could promise a lot and it could deliver a lot. Now it's the United States which promises a lot. End of story. It can't deliver. It cannot deliver. This is a problem that now is becoming acute. Let me end by where I started. Over the last 40 years, wages have been flat. They've gone nowhere. The American family has had to send out women and increasingly old people who have to stay in the labor force longer than they used to, and young people who have to do a little extra work, for all the reasons you know, just to maintain the standard. That wasn't enough more work, so they borrowed, which means there are people earning the same amount of money, but they're doing more work and they have more anxiety about the debts. And those of you that are young here, college students, you know what that debt does. You worry about it, sometimes acutely, as you should. The country can't deliver. The wages aren't going anywhere. They haven't for a long time. And you can't borrow anymore because you can't pay what you already owe. Where does this go? And the answer is it got nowhere to go. Opioids is where it's going. Prison is where it's going. Disintegration of communities all over the place. It's not an accident that we put 2 million people in jail. Yes, it's partly the substitution for slavery, the way Michelle Alexander has shown it so brilliantly. But it's not just that. It's not just a racial move. It solves a problem. Where are the jobs for those people? Where the hell would you give them an income, a life? Putting them in jail, it's a little bit like the GI Bill at the end of the war. It took all those young people wanting jobs for whom there were no jobs and stuck them in the university where they would be less dangerous socially than out on the street, unemployed, at a time when the socialist and communist parties in America were at their peak, 1945. No one want that. Anyway, it's a very sharp moment. And if you're interested, the logical next step would be to come back here the second Wednesday of June, where we'll be talking about Marxism and the particular way it offers insights into where we go now. Thank you very much for coming.